One time, out of curiosity, I decided to explore the deep web, a decision I came to regret. I had read online about something called Tor, a browser that allows people to access the deep web. On Reddit, I stumbled upon a thread where people were discussing some of the strangest things they'd come across on the deep web. It piqued my interest, and I decided to download Tor to see what it was all about. After setting it up, I came across a link someone shared that led to a so-called hidden wiki, full of links to various corners of the dark web. As I started exploring, I was shocked and disturbed by the sheer number of links related to illegal activities, particularly child pornography. Disgusted, I made a conscious effort to avoid anything of that nature. However, my curiosity drove me to continue browsing, and I eventually found a link leading to a page called The Black Pages. The page was ominously simple, with a black background and a collection of red and yellow links. The red links stood out as being particularly strange, with titles like Personal Assassin and Dead Pets. Just reading the names of some of these links made me realize how dark and unsettling this hidden side of the internet really was. Despite my unease, I continued exploring and clicked on a yellow link that led to another page of links. Among them, one caught my attention. It was called Secret Society Chat. When I clicked the link, the page took an unusually long time to load. For what felt like a full minute, I stared at a blank white screen, wondering if it would ever finish. Finally, the page turned black, and a chat box appeared on the screen next to a blank video window. Looking back, I wish I had just exited the browser right then and there. Instead, I typed "hey" into the chat box, curious about what would happen. What happened next was deeply unsettling. The blank video screen suddenly flickered to life, showing a person wearing a mask and sitting in a dark, shadowy room. My heart nearly stopped when I realized that my own face had appeared on the screen as well. The website had somehow activated my webcam without my permission. I instinctively covered the camera with my thumb and tried to close the page, but I quickly discovered that I couldn't. My taskbar was gone, and the usual minimize and exit buttons at the top of the browser window had disappeared. Panicking, I hit Ctrl-Alt-Delete, hoping to shut everything down, but even that didn't work. As I was frantically trying to regain control of my laptop, a muffled, distorted voice began to speak through my speakers. It was coming from the masked person on the screen, who was clearly using a voice changer to disguise their identity. What they said made my blood run cold. "I still see James." My heart sank as I heard my own name spoken aloud. In a desperate attempt to escape, I held down the power button on my laptop. It felt like an eternity before the device finally powered off. Shaken and terrified, I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I debated whether or not I should report the incident to the police, but I figured it wouldn't do much good. As far as I knew, everything on Tor was completely anonymous, and it seemed unlikely they'd be able to trace anything back to this hacker. I chalked it up to being targeted by some lowlife and resolved to move on with my life. I immediately deleted the Tor browser from my laptop and decided never to use it again. For a while, I thought that would be the end of it. But about 2 weeks later, something happened that brought all those fears rushing back. One day, my mom handed me an envelope that had arrived in the mail addressed to me. There was no return address, which struck me as odd. I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. My stomach dropped when I saw the message scrawled across the entire page in huge, bold letters. "Don't kill Lembeski." The sight of those words made me feel sick to my core. I crumpled up the paper and threw it away, trying to pretend it didn't happen. I didn't tell my mom about it because I didn't want to alarm her, and I decided against calling the police, thinking it would be pointless. To this day, I have no idea how they found my address or why they felt the need to send me that letter. All I know is that my brief foray into the deep web was a horrifying experience I will never repeat. The worst experience I ever had while using Tor was when I stumbled upon a website that I can only describe as horrifying and deeply disturbing. It was called Human Experiments, and I have no idea how I even found it. It was buried deep within some obscure link archive page. The homepage alone was enough to make my stomach turn. It described the site's purpose and content in gruesome detail, written in a red bloody font that only added to its sinister nature. The homepage declared that the experiments conducted for the website were designed to prove that not all humans are born equal. It explained that the victims chosen for these so-called experiments were typically homeless individuals, though others were unlucky enough to be kidnapped by the depraved people running the site. The experiments were horrifying in nature and ranged from starvation and water deprivation to testing reactions to extreme pain, torture, and even exposure to infectious diseases. To my horror, the site also described experiments conducted on infants and toddlers, testing their tolerances to X-rays, heat, and pain. I thought I could handle what I was about to see. I'd already seen my fair share of shocking and graphic videos online. Things like 3 guys, 1 hammer, but nothing could have prepared me for the horror that awaited. Against my better judgment, I clicked on a link leading to the experiment photos. The images I saw made me physically sick. I honestly had to fight the urge to throw up. I don't even want to describe the content in detail, but I will say that the victims were innocent people, human beings like you and me, being subjected to unimaginable suffering. Despite my growing nausea and dread, I found myself scrolling through the entire page. Each image was worse than the last, and eventually, I came across an entire section dedicated to infants and toddlers. I can't even begin to explain how gut-wrenching it was to see. Somehow, I reached the bottom of the page, feeling utterly horrified and disgusted, when a small box suddenly popped up on my screen. At first, I didn't know what it was. Then a line of text appeared in the box. It read, "Did you enjoy the site?" I was shocked. That's when I realized it was a chat box. Unsure of what to do, I typed back, "Who is this?" Almost immediately, the stranger replied. However, instead of answering my question, they asked me, "What was your favorite part of the site?" Feeling both angry and uneasy, I repeated my question, demanding to know who they were. This time they answered, claiming to be the site's owner. I couldn't believe I was communicating with someone so twisted. I immediately told them how sick and inhumane their site was, and that I was going to report it. Looking back, that was the biggest mistake I could have made. After a short pause, the stranger replied with something that made my blood run cold. They wrote, "I see your name is Michael, and you live in Massachusetts." I froze. They were right. My name and location were spot on. Still, I tried to act as though they were wrong. I quickly typed back, "No, you're wrong." But then, 10 seconds later, they sent another message, one that made my heart feel like it had stopped altogether. It was my full home address. Their final message before the chat box disappeared was simple: "Have a nice day." Terrified, I slammed my laptop shut and immediately called the police before I even told my parents what had happened. When the officers arrived, I explained everything as best as I could. They wanted to see my laptop, but unfortunately, since the Tor browser doesn't save browsing history, I couldn't provide them with the link to the website. That meant they had no way to track it down or shut it down. After hearing my story, the police strongly advised us to leave our home as soon as possible. They didn't say outright that we were in danger, but it was clear they thought we might be. Luckily, my family had already been considering moving at the time, and this terrifying event pushed us to act quickly. I was amazed at how fast my parents managed to sell a house and find a new place to live. I apologized to them every single day for at least a month after the incident. I hated that my actions had put them through so much stress and fear. I still feel guilty about it. To this day, I like to believe that the person I chatted with was bluffing and that they didn't actually have the means to harm us. But I couldn't take that chance. This experience taught me a valuable lesson. Nothing good comes from exploring the deep web. It's a place filled with unimaginable horrors, and no one should ever go looking for them. There was once a notorious website on the dark web called the Silk Road, infamous for being an underground marketplace for illegal drugs. I first heard about it through some friends who had used it before. At the time, our usual weed dealer was about to move out of state, and since he was our only reliable connection, my friends decided to give the Silk Road a shot. They swore by its legitimacy, claiming it was a hassle-free way to get what they needed. The timing couldn't have been better for me to try it out since my parents were away for the weekend on a trip to Atlantic City. So I downloaded the Tor browser, which is required to access the dark web, and checked the site out for myself. As expected, the biggest seller on the Silk Road was cannabis. After browsing through a few listings, I left a comment on one of the newer posts, asking anyone to confirm if the seller was legit. When I returned to the site about an hour later, I noticed I had a new message. It was from a user with the handle ill_EB. He had seen my comment and offered to sell me an ounce of weed at a price that was almost too good to be true. However, he mentioned that he only did local deals. At the time, I wasn't too worried about local deals because I had done them before without any issues. So I told him I lived in Washington State, and as luck would have it, he claimed he lived only about an hour away from me. I suggested that we meet halfway to make the exchange, but to my surprise, he insisted on coming all the way to my town. That seemed incredibly convenient, and I couldn't pass up the offer. He said he'd meet me after work around 9 p.m. and suggested we meet in the parking lot of a local Wendy's. However, before the meeting, he started asking me a bunch of strange questions, things like my exact address and who I lived with. Naturally, I didn't want to share my address with a drug dealer, so I lied and told him I lived alone. A bit later, he messaged me again, saying he'd found a better location for the deal. He suggested we meet behind an old, abandoned retail store at the edge of town. The suggestion set off my internal alarm bells. It sounded sketchy, but I was so desperate to score that weed that I ignored my instincts and agreed. I knew exactly where the building was, so I drove over, arriving within 5 minutes. When I got there, I parked behind the building but didn't see anyone else around. Shortly after, I received a text from him saying he was on his way. That message didn't make sense, though. If he lived an hour away, how would he already know about this obscure location? I waited in my car for about 20 minutes, texting him for updates, but he stopped responding altogether. By then, the uneasy feeling in my gut had grown too strong to ignore. I decided to call it off and leave while I still could. Something didn't feel right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. It took me about 10 minutes to drive back home, but as soon as I arrived, I noticed something was wrong. My front door was wide open. I was certain I had closed and locked it before leaving. My first thought was that my parents might have come home early, so I parked in the driveway and went inside to check. Upstairs, I saw a light on in my parents' bedroom and heard faint shuffling noises coming from the room. Thinking my parents might be unpacking or moving around, I called out, "Mom, Dad?" The moment I did, the noises stopped, and then, to my horror, the bedroom door slammed shut. At that point, I realized something was very wrong. My dad's car wasn't even in the driveway, and neither of them was answering. My heart started pounding as I finally pieced it together. Whoever was upstairs wasn't my parents. Still, instead of leaving or calling for help, I did something incredibly reckless. I grabbed a carving knife from the kitchen and charged upstairs to confront whoever was in the house. When I reached my parents' bedroom, I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door open so hard it almost broke off its hinges. The room was empty, or so I thought at first. That's when I noticed my mom's jewelry case was wide open, and some of her items were missing. Without thinking, I picked up the phone in their room and dialed 911. As soon as I started to tell the dispatcher what was happening, something grabbed me from under the bed. Panicking, I lashed out with the knife, stabbing whoever had grabbed me in the arm. The man screamed in pain, and I managed to pull away. Because it was a corded phone, I couldn't leave the room with it, so I quickly shouted to the dispatcher that someone had broken into my house and gave them my address before dropping the phone. The man crawled out from under the bed, the knife still lodged in his arm. Without even looking at me, he bolted out of the room and ran for the front door. All I could do was watch as he got into a black Honda Accord and sped away. The best description I could give the police was that he was a black man wearing a backward hat and ragged clothing. Unfortunately, I had no way to provide more details, and I couldn't mention the Silk Road or Tor browser, as they were illegal to use. That left the police with very little to go on, and the man who broke into my house is still out there, free. Looking back, I can only assume he got my address by hacking into my computer somehow. The whole experience left me shaken, and I'll never forget how close I came to putting myself and my family in serious danger.